Elizabeth and I were state grassroots leaders for Pete's campaign, along with leaders from the other congressional districts. From there, I was Elizabeth's treasurer for her run against Glenn Cassada. We all had hoped she would be sitting in our state house, but God had another plan for Elizabeth. In January 2021, Elizabeth joined the Southern Christian Coalition, and there they are working to elevate the voices of pastors who are speaking out in support of policies that reflect the Christian value of loving our neighbors as yourself and standing up against bad theology and political ideology that is dangerous and harms our communities. A few weeks ago, I was introduced virtually to Michael Slaby by Heidi Adams, a world leader in digital strategy and technology and how they drive organizations and companies. Michael Slaby is chief strategist at Harmony Labs, working on accelerating media reform and transformation. Previously, he founded and was head of Mission Timeshell, hopefully I said that right, a social impact technology company. He was a fellow at the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Michael helped lead the Obama for America campaign as Chief Integration and Innovation Officer in 2012, where he oversaw all technology and analytics, and as a Deputy Digital Director and Chief Technology Officer in 2008. That's a resume. Michael is the author of a new book, For All the People. Yay. His first book on the relationship between media, technology, and our civic life. He has served as an advisor and board member to initiatives including the United Nations, the U.S. State Department, IMALS, RISE, Bright Pink, I Am That Girl, and Live Strong, and was named to Crain's Chicago 40 Under 40 and Tech 50. He is a graduate of Brown University and currently lives in Rhinebeck, New York, with his much more awesome wife, Lydia Hill Slaby. We welcome both of you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. And for those of you that are viewing, you can enter comments in the comments section, and hopefully we can get to them as we move through this. Today's conversation will be an open forum for you, the audience, to ask questions, hear Michael's advice on reaching voters of all shades of blue, find out about Elizabeth's experience running for office in a very red state, and the good work she is doing with the Southern Christian Coalition. My first question is to you, Michael. When I say all politics are personal, what does that mean to you?
First, thanks for inviting me into your community. I'm excited by the chance to meet you guys and listen to you and hear what your experience is like in a very different part of the country. And being a Democratic committee in a pretty red county is an intense experience, and I think it reflects a lot about how we tell stories and how we interact as a community, how we learn how to coexist with difference, which are all things that I think are really important in politics right now. And there's a lot to learn from your experience. So I'm really grateful that you guys invited me to be part of this conversation. When I think about all politics as personal, obviously it's sort of it's a riff on the sort of old aphorism of all politics is local, which gets attributed to lots of people, but was really sort of associated with Tip O'Neill in the 80s, talking about what's most important in politics. And what I think is true, what he meant when he said all politics is local is that what matters to each person is unique and special. And back then, and in older sort of looking back further, what was local is often what is most important to people, but is not always. And all politics is personal, I think, is a more both sort of like empathetic way of thinking about, we all see the world in a unique way. And what matters most to me is unique to me. And we do a disservice to voters and to our communities when we interact with them as caricature. And I think when we think about media systems and we think about social media and technology, one of the things that I find sort of most problematic about the way that we tell stories and share information is that we tend to interact with people as caricature, right? That we don't see each other as clearly. We don't see each other with sort of nuance and empathy. it's not really what these systems are optimized for. And, in the world that we're living in now, especially this year of a pandemic and sort of isolation and more virtual experiences, it opens up certain things. Like, I love the fact that I'm having this event with you. I think if I was on a traditional book tour, I don't know if I'd be in Williamson County. Although I bet it's awesome. So I probably would have made time, and Heidi is a good friend, and I'm grateful that she introduced me to you, and I think we would have made this work anyway. But it opens up certain doors. But that's if you're really looking carefully for in sort of new doors, and are sort of open to saying yes and listening carefully. And I think Linda is in the chat saying she's having some trouble with audio. So I hope that's only Linda. Well, for Linda's sake, I hope we can figure it out, but I hope that's just her. What I think is important as we think about this in the context of sort of politics is the reality that we need to at our best see each other in sort of full color, and see each other as full people, and be willing to engage with people sort of in all of our imperfection, and not engage with each other based on caricature. I think we have a much greater capacity for empathy. And there's been a lot of talk about sort of questions about, whoa, look at that ticker tape URL. That's amazing. Sorry. There's, one of the experiences of, I'm just going to riff for this of the pandemic, is we get to experience like a whole new Zoom every week. Like somebody finds a new platform, and StreamYard, this is a whole nother one. I'm just so excited. This is so great. I've got live animated chyrons. I feel so official. It's like MSNBC or something.
We are official.
So I think that's where I want to stop the comment is that because all politics is personal, we are best served by seeing each other as people and trying as best we can to interact with like nuance and empathy. And the challenge with that often is that the systems we rely on for communications and storytelling don't reward those things. Political Twitter doesn't reward nuance and caution and care and thoughtfulness. The platform's really optimized around outrage, and it shows in the sort of nature of the way we campaign and the way we argue. And my experience is that in my personal conversations with people with whom I disagree are very different than the conversations that we see in the media. Mm-hmm. And that feels like a problem we need to get after, which is part of why I wrote this book. I
mean, Elizabeth, like her experience.
Yeah, I want to hear what your personal experience was like.
Is she made phone calls, at least like 100 a day sometimes, and she had volunteers calling every day to voters. And I'll let you tell them the things that you experienced.
Well, I actually think this was a podcast that I heard that you were on, Michael, today, that was talking about how we think people are. They're Democrats or Republicans, and so everybody in this box or that box agrees with all this Democratic Party platform, or this person agrees with all the Republican Party platform. When if we look at registrations, I think it was podcast you were on, they said like almost a quarter of the country identifies as Republican, almost a third is Democrat, and that leaves us at almost half of Americans that don't identify themselves with either party. They're independent. And talking to voters, in obviously a pretty conservative district, man, people are very complicated. It's very hard to put people in boxes. People would be, really upset or really want some like more gun safe legislation, but then also at the same time want to, we're also really concerned about the rise of racial justice protests and really thought that they were getting out of hand. And we're really critical of, even Biden standing up for racial justice protests. And that, in our minds, that doesn't fit into neat little boxes. And everybody has different things that they care about. We all have our own life experiences. And the only way we can get past it and to like come to common ground is having conversations and see what's important to each person and hear their story. And whether we're doing Facebook ads or trying to get hit or Twitter hot takes that go viral or whatever, like you said, it's just, it all seems geared towards one thing instead of listening and understanding. So I absolutely agree. And unfortunately, Facebook algorithms are forcing us further apart.
Yeah, that's something as I was reading your book for all the people.
Thanks for doing that for me, because it feels goofy when I do it for myself.
I would like you to kind of explain, because I was reading about the graphs and the bubbles and things. Like, explain to us, like, Facebook for Dummies, how they are using our searches and all that sort of stuff. Because I notice it a little bit. Like, I see posts from I have 300 some friends, but I see the posts from the same sort of group of people. And it takes me actually to have to go through my friends list to be like, oh, I haven't heard from so-and-so in a while. Let me go check. And I'm like, they've posted like 17 times and I haven't seen any
why
of
aren't
this.
I seeing any of this?
So can you explain how that works to us?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think it speaks to a sort of a bigger challenge, is that the systems we use for storytelling are just wildly more complicated than they've ever been. And that there's a lot of opportunity in that. Like, we're having this amazing conversation. I'm in New York. We're doing it live on like 7 platforms. It's amazing. Like, it's amazing. We just had live chyrons going across the screen on like your personal Facebook. It's great. However, I think we misunderstand a lot of times the incentives behind the platforms we rely on. And Facebook is a business, and they're in the business of making money. And they make money largely by selling our attention to advertisers who want to buy our attention. And so their entire system is, it started out, as a way of, of sustaining relationships at a distance. When it was in a Harvard dorm room, it was about sort of knowing each other on campus. And, a lot of us have probably seen the movie The Social Network. I think there's probably a lot of truth in sort of the, we don't even know what we're building here aspect to what you see in the original story. But now that they're this massive, multi-billion user, multinational corporation, they're optimized around what serves the business. And what serves the business is more attention inventory that they can sell to advertisers who want to buy our behavior. And what that means is that while we engage with it as a mechanism for trying to stay connected to each other, it is in Facebook's interest to show us things that make us do more Facebook. They're optimizing around us clicking more and commenting more and sharing more. And the things we tend to click on and share and argue about tend to be things that do one of two things: confirm bias and perspective we already have. So the idea of sorting based on confirmation bias. So we tend to interact with and engage with things that we already agree with, which sort of narrows our view of the world. And over time, we start to feel like everybody agrees with us. Or things that are going to outrage us. And I talk a lot joke a lot about in the book, the idea of the tyranny of outrage, which is that it makes our experience of the world, especially around important issues in civic life, really, really geared toward conflict. And what's important about this is we're talking about Facebook and Facebook's algorithm and how it optimizes our experience. What it's doing is choosing what we see. And those choices turns out matter a lot to our understanding of the world, to our understanding of each other. When Facebook is making these choices, largely we can't tell how they're getting made. We don't really have it. It's very hard to turn off the algorithm, right? Just show me everything in a chronological order. It's not even an option anymore. And because that's happening, we are no longer choosing what to engage with. Those choices are getting made for us. And Facebook would argue that what they're trying to do is give us what we want. But if what we want, like Elizabeth was just talking about, is a conversation where I can listen with some nuance and clarity to all the people around me and people of different opinions, that may create a really nice, nuanced, empathetic conversation about our civic life. but it doesn't produce the kind of like outrage and rage clicking and all this kind of stuff that really drives Facebook's business. And so what we need from a healthy public sphere, like the ability to have, a thoughtful, careful, multidimensional, nuanced conversation, is at odds with Facebook's business. And that's where we need to sort of intervene sort of as a culturally. And there's a lot of changes that I suggest in the book around how we interact with technology, how we choose to use technology, how those technologies are designed, how we regulate technology, how the business of media works. And all of them are related to this idea that we need more agency to be able to choose what we engage with and how we engage with it. And our behavior being driven by the things that make Facebook the most money, turns out I don't think is very good for our civic life, because it's part of, the dichotomy we were just talking about, both Elizabeth's experience and what I was saying about, how I engage with people at the farmer's market. So I live in a rural county too. I live in New York, but I live in the Hudson Valley. And when I moved here, I joined the volunteer fire department and I became an EMT as a way to give back to the community and do something useful and, try to become a local. Most of the firehouse, not all, but a lot of the firehouse are sort of like old working, like crusty working class Republican New Yorkers. And they're awesome. And they are the people I'm closest to in this community. They've opened their lives in the community to me and my wife. And it's been a really wonderful experience. But if I interacted with them the way I interact with sort of opposing political people on Twitter, or what sort of hot take Twitter is like, I don't know if I would have been welcome in the building. I don't think they might not even have wanted my sort of like city liberal Chicago, Obama, whatever, anywhere near, and what we discovered, of course, is that we live in a community. We're much more alike than would possibly be different. We disagree on some stuff, but we are bound together by the reality that we're all willing to get up at 3 a.m. when our neighbor falls on the floor. And turns out that matters more for the purposes of why we are in a community, and community is something we do together. And the action of being in community and doing that work, it helps sort of knit us together in a way that's actually really important. And now we do disagree on stuff, and we should, and that's fine. But we need to figure out how to coexist with difference and argue in a way that is productive and isn't just about sort of an engine for outrage.
Well, we have a couple of questions in the comments. Before I do that, I'm going to say, and this is a props to Elizabeth, is that as long as I've known her, which is almost 2 years now, she's always been so cool and calm, like with her comments and things. Like, she gets people on her Facebook and social media pages, and I've always been so impressed with how professional and open to engaging with them. Like, I get more like hot about it. Like, I just want them to tell them to suck it or something. But she, like, that's one thing I love about her, is that she has handled it with such grace, and she welcomes the conversation, even online. She does it. But that's one thing that I think is so stellar about her. And it's also kind of tied to the whole why I like Pete so much, is that he really encouraged us to get out and talk to people, because politics is personal, and you can't just have a really good conversation about an issue on Twitter. You need to like engage with people face to face. And I don't know what it says about me, but I have a lot of Republicans in my life. And like a couple weeks ago, one of them, who's very Republican, said, "You're the nicest Democrat I've ever met, and you're like one of the only ones we like." And I'm like, I don't know. That's a compliment.
Is that a compliment? I don't know. I can't tell.
All the Democrats I know are perfectly lovely.
But she's like, because you don't take it so serious. Like, we can have a conversation, and it's not like you immediately think I hate you or we hate each other. We can disagree, but still love each other. So I think, we need as a society to work more towards that, is to like understand that I mean, I have immediate family members that are very Republican, and I love them. We might not agree, so we either choose not to chat about it too much, or we have polite conversations about it, you know. Anyway.
Well, Michael, some of the things you were talking about really remind me. I don't know if you read. Sorry to bring up Mayor Pete again, but his newer book, Trust, which talks about needing to like widen our circles to the things that we have in common with people that may not be politics. And right now, politics seems to be the most polarized area of our community, of our country, and where we're really, you know, and we're just kind of isolating ourselves into silos. And, you know, there used to be a whole lot more community involvement in boosters groups or other community engagement activities, and which of course COVID has prevented us from doing in person. But that the more we can, like exactly like your story about being at the fire, I guess, is it the fire station? Is that still the correct
firehouse? Yeah, we call it the firehouse.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful picture of what community looks like, is connecting even when you don't agree on everything and building those relationships, because how else do we build community trust?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. There's two good questions in the chat. One from Linda, who I'm glad her audio is working, is around sort of different incentives for social media. Before I answer her question directly, one of the things I want to suggest is that this is not just, I think all of media is a little, is working counter to what we need our public sphere to work like. It's not just a question of Facebook and Twitter are destroying democracy. I think the way news works is problematic. There's the sort of same incentives around conflict because of how sort of the landscape of information has shifted. We have sort of essentially one large economy of attention, and that means that all different types of information tend to compete using the same incentives, and that means news and cat videos are sort of competing in the same way for our attention, and that's a problem for a lot of reasons. And so one of the things I think is really important about new incentives is that we just make healthy discourse and a healthy public sphere something that these responsibility these companies have to own up to. And I think they didn't all start out searching for that responsibility, but they have it. And whether they wanted it or not, they have it. And I think when in the early days of social media, and even back in the early days of the internet, there was a sort of cyber utopian, greater connectivity is going to make the world more empathetic and more democratic. And there was a little bit of sort of cyber utopian naivety to some of those like early days of innovation around the rise of the internet in general, but also around the rise of social media. And I think what we need to do is make explicit our needs for healthy discourse. Make explicit what does it mean to create a healthy environment for healthy, productive discussion, and optimizing at least in some dimension. It doesn't necessarily mean, I'm not saying Facebook can't sell ads. I'm not saying Facebook can't optimize their business around profit. They're a corporation. They're probably going to do that. But I do think that understanding the impact on community and optimizing for community and not just for individual experience is part of the equation. And making explicit what we need from the sort of pillars of our public sphere will help change how we think about what success looks like and what they're designing toward. Because I think an important distinction here is that I don't think these systems are broken. I think they're working exactly as they were designed. They're just not designed to make discourse healthy. They're designed to make Facebook money. And it turns out that, you know, outrage is more valuable than nuance for a lot of reasons. And that that has sort of pushed its way into news on, you know, print journalism, on cable news is a whole nother animal that's been sort of devolving for a long time. And all together, what it means is that our ability to understand each other in the world is it's just really, really difficult. Making the effort, Christy, that you're describing around how Elizabeth engages even online, with this sort of careful, thoughtful, a willingness to listen was the first thing Elizabeth said. Taking a step and being thoughtful and listening is not really what these platforms encourage. What they want you to do is click and retweet and rage doom scroll and consume forever and like never feel like you're informed, right? Like feel like you have to hear the next thing or watch the next thing or read the next thing. There is no being informed. There's no sense of enoughness to the way we engage with story or with other people. And all of those things are working against our humanity.
And that reminds me of
the next question is from my uncle. So I think we have to take this one.
Well, I'll let Elizabeth finish what she was going to say.
I'm losing you guys audio. Can you guys still hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I can hear you.
I will check.
I was going to say, I know someone who is, who really,
go ahead, Elizabeth.
She just feels like she said, when I go into Facebook or even when I turn on the news now, I just don't even know who to trust anymore, right? Because there's so many people shouting different things and outraged, mad about everything that you say, that it gets, then people end up, you can also have the extreme of people turning off and not even wanting to know what's going on anymore, where then they don't even they don't engage at all, whether in social media or in real life or even watching, a morning news show, feeling like, there's too much all the time coming at me and everyone seems to be an expert and nobody seems to be an expert.
Right.
And
that sense of information overload is another sort of common feature of the way these systems are working, is that we live in this sort of perpetual state of being overloaded, which is part of why we need shortcuts to make sense of all of these things. And because it's really hard to tell the difference between, for instance, credible content and not credible content, or someone who's an expert and someone who's not, or a cat video and a note from my mom, or something from Alex Jones, or it's hard to tell the difference. The things that we rely on as filters for that tend to be things like confirmation bias and or proximity. Like if it comes from somebody who I'm close to, it must be true. And the things like celebrity and proximity are actually pretty bad substitutes for a trust and authority and credibility and expertise. And it has made us suspicious of expertise. And, there are lots of contexts in which expertise can be sort of overrated and common sense matters. But there are also lots of contexts in which expertise is really important, like a public health crisis. Mm-hmm. And our inability to distinguish credible from not credible is one of the features that keeps us scrolling. But it's also one of the features that reduces the quality of our sort of information ecology. We are sort of feel less informed, even though we have more media than we've ever had. Mm-hmm. But to Bruce's question here about what does it mean for someone to be very Republican, I think this Christy was talking about this in her sort of story about her family. I think it's reflected in what Elizabeth was saying about how we tend to interact with caricatures and with boxes because we're trying to sort information. And I think seeing someone as, a strong example of a type, is just, someone who's very Republican is sort of the opposite, someone who's very liberal. And then we sort of seeing the world in this like very sort of two-dimensional, it's actually one-dimensional gradient of like left and right, and putting people into sort of very narrow boxes and definitions. And I think it turns out that most issues that we face and the sort of the nature of the world, like a really, as Elizabeth was describing, like most people don't agree with everything that even the party they usually vote for or are a member of. I don't agree with everything the Democratic Party stands for. Mm-hmm. There are lots of things in the sort of Democratic Party policy sort of planks that I think are mistakes. And so I think it's a shortcut and a shorthand when we use phrases like very Republican, very Democrat, that are kind of examples of how the systems of sorting sort of shortcut the way we see people. And we need, like I said, we need the shortcuts. We're sort of desperate for them because of how overwhelmed we feel. But it's a good example of like trying to see people in more dimension, trying to see issues in more dimension too, right? That like, it's not, turns out there's probably more than left and right about most things, right? If most issues aren't that simple, there aren't that few options. And the other things that I find very frustrating, like even inside the Democratic Party, is that the sort of the sort of constant pressure to adhere to orthodoxy, even inside the party, makes our ideas worse, because we can't even disagree in safety inside the party with other people with whom we mostly agree. Right. And that means our ideas aren't getting better. And that's one of my, I'll give a very concrete example. When we think about healthcare, and there's, a lot of the debate in the 2020 primary was about sort of, Medicare for all. I am in favor of universal access to good healthcare. Medicare for all is a way to get to that. There may be other policy mechanisms to get to that. What I want to sort of to agree to as a party is the idea that everyone should have access to healthcare, and that your health matters to my health. That's the conversation I want to have. And that the government is responsible for ensuring or playing a role in ensuring that we all are healthy. After that, we can debate how to do it. Medicare for all is the debate about the policy, not the debate about the principle. And by making the policy the party plank, or considering that, it means that okay, let's say Medicare for all, we all agree that's a good idea. What if we come up with a better idea? We have to change the party? Or do we throw out the better idea because it doesn't adhere to the party platform? That's scary. Like, turns out we actually need to argue even about our best ideas, because that's how they get better. Mm-hmm. And this is something, this sort of values-based alignment around community tends to create bigger spaces. But it requires a willingness to be wrong, and it requires a willingness to not agree and still sort of be in the same family. And those are all things that we need in lots of dimensions. Mm-hmm. Inside the party, inside the country, that we sort of decide we are united around other things, and that the distinction and the difference is okay. And look, there are some distinctions that aren't okay. Like, I am not interested in, there's been a lot of debate post-election, post-Capitol riots on January 6th, on this whole like unifying with white supremacy. We need to make space for everyone. Actually, we don't. There are actually sort of ideas, and this is where the grading gets really difficult. In a healthy society, there are certain things that we decide are not okay, right? Mm-hmm. We decide that certain behaviors are not okay, and that's why we have laws. And we just do that certain cultural things are unacceptable, and the oppression of one group over another, not acceptable. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with excluding that kind of ideology, but that's a values-based choice that we need to make sort of broadly and collectively, and not as a knee-jerk. Mm-hmm. And the knee-jerk part of it is the part that scares me a little, because it can be too blunt an instrument.
I mean, I think that kind of ties in nicely with what Elizabeth's doing. Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the work you guys are doing?
Yes. Well, I wanted to say that that's probably why, Michael, you get along with those guys at the firehouse, that you may not agree on policy, but your values are the same. And your methods of how that's lived out, those opinions are different, but the values of family and community and taking care of people, right? Mm-hmm. And so yes, I'm really excited about my new work with Southern Christian Coalition, and it's really an honor to work with pastors across. See, look, fancy Chiron.
I know, I'm giggling. More Chirons.
Yes, that we really work to elevate the voices of pastors and faith leaders across the state of Tennessee, who are standing up in support of policy that supports the Christian values, mostly love your neighbor as yourself. We come back a lot to Micah 6:8, which is do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And in the state of Tennessee, unfortunately, there's a lot of policy that is passed and promoted by our elected officials that uses that claims Christian values, but I don't think actually matches Christian values. And it's actually dangerous to our community. And it's an honor to work with pastors across the state who agree and to be able to elevate their voices in the media. So, for example, last week, this has been going on for a couple months, but basketball players at East Tennessee State University decided to start kneeling in support of racial justice. Their coach supported them. A couple of state senators from out in that direction thought it was really disrespectful, publicly said it was like giving a finger to the military. They ended up passing a big resolution. All the Republican state senators joined in support, unfortunately, and really there ended up being enough pressure that the coach left, and now basketball players are leaving. And that's something that's been talked a lot about in the media, and it's being talked a lot on social media. And we had pastors that spoke up and said standing up for racial justice is, a biblical principle. We as Christians should be standing for justice and equality. And it's, really a shame that we have had these state leaders that were condemning these student athletes, not just for, standing up for justice, but also exercising their First Amendment right. And so those quotes were picked up by the media, and I think it's neat to be able to see, hopefully, those athletes and that coach see that there are pastors standing behind them. Another big example would be Medicaid expansion. Tennessee is one of the few states that still hasn't expanded Medicaid. But again, that comes to what you were saying, Michael, with our values, is that everybody should have access to quality and affordable health care. And by passing that up, we are, missing out on that biblical call to love the least of these, in this case, those who don't have access to healthcare. And so yeah, that's a lot of the work we do. And again, it's values based, right? It comes back to what do we care about and getting the word out, and starting with listening to people, and hopefully realizing most Tennesseans do have the same, do have those values. So
one of the things that I love about the work you're doing is, and this is something that I really respected about, I was about to say Mayor Pete, Secretary Pete. Secretary Pete a thing? Is that feels weird to say.
Pete, I don't know.
Yeah, I know it sounds strange. But about Secretary Buttigieg is his comfort being very, very liberal on a lot of issues, deeply progressive, and very deeply, clearly a man of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the sort of shifts in the Democratic Party, as partially as a sort of a consequence of urbanization and sort of the narrowing, the Democratic Party sort of becoming more coastal, is that there's an allergy sometimes to faith, and there's sort of a smug sort of coastal elitism around religion that I think really doesn't serve the party well, because I think it's really inconsistent with how most people live. Most people have a spiritual life of some kind. There's been a lot of talk about sort of the role, or the shrinking role, of organized religion in American culture. And there's a lot to be said about that. Why, what's happening, church enrollment, all these kinds of questions. But most people believe in, like, profoundly in a spiritual life, and not being able to talk about faith as a center point of why we value what we value, and talk candidly and openly and earnestly about sort of the meaning of life and what we get from faith, has actually made our party a lot weaker. And we have ceded the moral ground around faith to a Republican Party that is, equally full of people who have deep spiritual lives, but who often sort of cloak pretty hypocritical positions in faith and don't get called on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I like that you're willing to stand up and say that's not Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's actually super important. for us not to cede. One of the things that we are most in desperate need of as a country is like clear moral leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about this sort of need for sort of, I talk about values based and ethics and sort of moral leadership around media and technology. You know, I'm talking about sort of the morals of what do we value, what is important to us, and making those things really explicit instead of assuming that we're going to get them, assuming that we're going to have a healthy public sphere provided by private companies. Turns out that assumption is not working for us. And being explicit about what we believe is really important. And just reclaiming some moral clarity about what's okay and what's not is actually something we really need from our institutions and leaders. It's one of the things, Elizabeth, to your point before, I want to echo something you said and sort of expand on people turning away from civic life because, you know, it just seems so gross. It seems so corrupt and mean, and it doesn't really matter to me who's in, like, they're all a bunch of thieves and liars. And you can overstate that. Like, I think there's a difference. I think, you know, the difference between President Biden and President Trump is pretty significant. But I also understand people who say it really doesn't matter to me. Like, my life is my, like, it, it feels so often it feels so out of touch. And the things that we fight about in politics and that we turn into these existential political wars feel so disconnected from everyday experience that I understand why people pull away from civic participation. And I get really frustrated when it's in the same way that, like, you hear people in the media say, you know, we're just giving people what they want, like blaming us for Facebook being gross. It's like, it's not my fault Facebook's gross. Like, and it's, you know, by the way, I'm aware that we're doing this on Facebook, right? Like, we're trying to make a healthier conversation inside a system that's not really designed for healthy conversation. It's hard. But I also don't blame voters for our lack of participation. And leaders who blame voters as apathetic need to take a fucking seat, because they are not listening to the sort of corruption that they are making a system that people don't want to participate in. And that's their fault. Not everyone, not all the time, not everyone is corrupt, not everyone's a problem, but the systems are not working well, and our leaders need to take responsibility for that too. Sorry for cussing. I thought I might get through this conversation without it, but it almost never happens. So I apologize.
Here in the South, we say "bless your heart," so I mean, we're good.
My whole family, my whole other side. So my uncle that's here is my dad's brother. The whole mom's side of the family is all from Tennessee. So "oh, bless your heart" sounds awfully familiar to me.
Hi, Uncle Bruce. We have a couple of questions that we had missed from back here. Let's see. I'm guessing this is geared towards you, Michael.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the question about, like, where is the space, and I think one of the challenges, one of the things that people talk a lot about, there's been a lot of talk about it since President Biden was inaugurated, around sort of the antitrust monopoly implications of media, right? And one of the challenges with that, you know, one of the traditional antitrust problems is pricing and price pressure and ineffective markets. Ultimately, I don't actually care that much about the sort of pricing for advertising as a consumer problem. What I do care about is monopoly power crushing creativity and innovation. And this is where the dominance of Google and Facebook in particular make it very hard to create new spaces. And we need a couple of things. I think we need to reclaim space, like by doing this, by having a healthy, careful conversation in a space that's not necessarily designed for it, by trying really hard to have, I got into a back and forth with a pretty libertarian guy on Facebook about markets, it was on Twitter. And we ended up having a really good conversation, but it was really hard. Like, I was like, I literally wrote a book about this, and I was still having trouble not being snide and not being smug and not, like, It's really hard not to sort of fall into the sort of style of the environment. And so part of it is reclaiming existing ground. And then part of it is in fact about new spaces. And this is where, antitrust enforcement and sort of inspiring more creativity and innovation in media, sort of thinking about media ownership, thinking about things like liability protection and all these sorts of sort of kind of hot topics in the tech nerd policy world. I don't know if we can call them hot topics. I might be stretching it a bit. But these things matter a lot. And where there is a regulatory component to this situation, because it's not, when you hear this is improving, but when you see someone like Mark Zuckerberg go to Congress to testify and he has to tell them how he makes money, it doesn't bode well for Congress's ability to legislate effectively and regulate effectively on a topic that they don't grok fully. It is improving. The latest misinformation and disinformation committee hearings were much better. But what is still missing, and this is when I talk about moral leadership, what I mean is them recognizing that these systems are not working is better. Seeing them more clearly. Why? How are they not working? How are they undermining just civic life? But where do we want them to go? What it sounds like where we are stuck right now is, oh God, please be better. But we don't necessarily have a lot of clarity about what better means. And I think that's one of the things that's missing from the conversation, that we need to put effort into what do we mean by public discourse? What do we mean by healthy disagreement? What do we mean by productive conflict? How do we optimize around those things? And some of the work that I do at the nonprofit where I work, Harmony Labs, is around trying to define the idea and principles around beneficial media. Like, what would it look like if these systems were actually good for us as humans? And what would they, if they were good for society? What would it, if the values at work around, engagement and optimizing around outrage and sort of, FOMO and infinite scrolling and indistinguishability are the values at work in the current systems that are making us sick, like physically sick and psychologically sick and civically sick? What are the values at work in systems that make us healthy? And it turns out we can define those things, but we need to do it as a broad public conversation, and not expect private companies to do it on their own. They're probably not going to. And these are publicly traded private companies. Like these are not government. There is no public internet anymore. We are reliant on Verizon and L3 communications for backhaul and bandwidth and ISPs and Comcast and Facebook for access, that is the nature of the sort of wildly deregulated information market that we have inherited over the last couple of decades. And so we need to do some wrangling. Like we got to get our hands around it, or it's going to keep right now, the reclaiming spaces and just trying to be healthier and healthier spaces is an awful lot of work. We are swimming against a multi-billion-dollar stream, and that is exhausting. And there's some other good work. Eli Pariser and Talia Stroud have been working on a project called Civic Signals and a thing called New Public, which is trying to articulate exactly what do we know about healthy public spaces like parks and why they're good for communities. We have a much longer history about public spaces, physical public spaces, than we do about online spaces. What can we learn from one to influence the other? And they have been publicly expressing principles as like a fundamental output of the conversation so that other people can design around these principles. And this is part of what we need. It is going to be it took us, 500 years, mass communication sort of started with the printing press. So blame Gutenberg. I don't know.
So it sounds like what you're saying is it's not necessarily something that I can fix and change on my own in my Facebook interactions, but we need to advocate for better policy and more regulations that make it work for everybody. So, Facebook, I'm sure, has tons of lobbyists.
Of course.
For them. And we need
of course.
we need this seems like something that should be bipartisan, right? That we all want to have a well-regulated public square, both physically like the park and virtually like the social media, right?
Yes. Two things. One, I would say it's both and. Our behavior matters. Our choices matter. Ad boycotts matter. Platform boycotts matter. I highly recommend turning off all the notifications on your phone. Take all of the social media apps off your home screen. To turn your phone, switch your phone to black and white. Do little things. Not all phones do that, but many of them do.
What does that mean, Michael?
Switch your screen to black and white instead of being. It means that like when bright red notifications pop up, they don't hit your brain with that little like, oh my God, there's an emergency dopamine reaction you have to like clicking on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you just a little bit of distance. I mean, these systems are literally designed to be addictive, and it gives you just like a fighting chance to, choose how you interact with these things and say like, okay, I'm not going to do this because the notification is making me do this. And I'm getting sucked in by my psychology. I have a minute. I want to check on my friends. I'm going to use Instagram as a way of seeing into my community and checking in with people. And it's just a very different choice. It's a much more intentional. It's me having at least a little bit of agency, reclaiming a little bit of agency about how I choose and what I choose. And, choice is pretty fundamental to democracy. It's pretty fundamental to my autonomy as a citizen to be making choices like that. And people would argue that it's less efficient. And I don't care. I think it is healthier. It is better for me to make those choices, even if I repetitively make them, than to ignore them. My cousin, my uncle is saying we should delete our Facebook accounts. I barely use Facebook, partially because I just don't have a lot of value out of it. But there's certain people that I would completely lose touch with entirely if I got rid of Instagram, for instance. And I don't want to. And so, there is a bravery to just opting out of these systems. Then I think that's true. What my uncle is suggesting is true. And look, if we all deleted Facebook, Facebook would go out of business and we'd start from scratch. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't want to lose touch with my Uncle Bruce. I'm glad that he's in this thing. I haven't seen him in a long time. I feel closer to him because he's getting to hear me talk about these things that I've been working on for years. And that feels really good. It is a feature of this conversation and now my high school calculus teacher is also here. My favorite teachers of all time. So look, this wouldn't happen without it. And so it's not all bad. Just like some of the other things that we've been talking about, it's not all bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like these tools are in fact mechanisms for connectivity and generativity and mechanisms for maintaining relationships at a distance. And they are capable of being better actors in society. And we just need to push them more toward the better angels. It's just like the rest of us, right? Like I, as a pretty liberal, as I've spent most of my career being a professional Democrat, I'm super competitive and I like winning elections and I like it when my team wins. And I don't agree with my party all the time. And there are totally sort of well-intentioned people of service and integrity who are not on my team. And it's okay when they win. And sometimes those people represent their districts better than I do. That's okay too. How would I act differently if their participation was important to my civic life as I think my participation is? That's the question I just sort of want to leave with people as we're getting toward the top of the hour, is seeing politics and civic life as sort of in a lens of all or nothing is part of what is hurting our civic life. There is total victory is not something we actually are looking for, right? That's when I listen to very progressive leaders on the left, I wonder if they think they should ever have to interact with someone they disagree with. Like, where do they think people are going to go? Like, do they want people to leave or just shut up? And in either case, like, that doesn't sound like brotherhood. That doesn't sound like community. And that sounds like imposition. And I don't want that either. And so being comfortable living in proximity to difference, this is where we started when we were in the back room, in the virtual green room. I'm so interested in your experience where you live, because you don't live, I lived in downtown Chicago for 20 years. I almost never interacted with somebody who disagreed with me. Everybody is liberal. It's the city. That's not most people's experience. And you live in proximity, close proximity with a lot of people with you disagree with all the time. And it changes your perspective in a really important way. And so I think your experience is really helpful to everyone thinking about, what does it mean to have a healthy civic body that is whole and complete, and where everybody participates, and where we are actually interested in the other people participating? How would we campaign differently? I think we would.
Right. It should. Yeah, I agree. It should be. I think that's one of the big downsides of the past 5-ish years of politics is it's really important for civic life that we have healthy parties that are making solutions based on reality.
Yep.
And I think that's a big part of the problem now. And I will say that's one reason why I'm not tempted to leave Facebook, is because I think, who are the people in my life that are not living in reality? And can I be one slice of reality that they might see in their feed, right? And don't want to seed it over to total disinformation. Because I think whatever our policy views, at the end of the day, they're only as good as the ones that are based in reality, that actually help people. And we have to have those conversations to get to those places.
I think that's right.
Well, this has been amazing, and I didn't even make it past my first page of questions. I kind of knew, and I didn't even hit the tabs on your book, Michael.
Look at that. That is a well-loved book. I appreciate that. That makes me very happy.
You guys can find this at michaelslaby.com or Amazon, different booksellers.
Bookshop.org, your local independent bookstore will get it for you, all the above.
Yeah, like Parnassus, support local, and
there you go.
Mark booksellers. Go in, Patchett. And Patchett owns one of Nashville's
no way.
bookstores. Yeah, and she'll do like, she's obviously done book signings there since it's literally her bookstore.
Elizabeth, how can people get involved with your organization?
Yes, absolutely. Go to southernchristians.org and you can just sign up to get involved, and you'll be on our newsletter and be in touch with all the stuff we're doing, and we'll send you, in case you missed it, emails so you can catch what happened in the media this week, where we got to elevate those voices of people of faith.
And Michael, let us know if you want to come help us elect some candidates.
I'm in.
We could use some help down here, Just one little blue dot would be good. One little blue dot.
Or purple. We can be flexible.
Think big. Think big.
Sounds
Well,
good to me.
thank you guys so much for joining us. You guys, those that haven't been able to see this, you'll be able to see it later on Facebook and then on our YouTube channel and our website. So you guys, thank you. Have a good night.
Nice to meet you,
Thanks so
Michael.
much, everyone. Take care.